I see in the future that millennials are going to be saving the podcasting industry because of Spotify and because of Google Home and because of Alexa. I think these podcasts are here to stay.
Podcast Junkies, episode 179. Welcome back. I'm your host, Harry Duran. If you are new to this podcast and you just discovered it either through a conference I was at or a talk I gave, then welcome. I'm so happy you're here. I'm so happy you're part of the Podcast Junkies family. A little bit about the show. This is the place where we have fascinating conversations with folks that are in the podcast world, podcasters who are doing amazing things that I've come across, and in the interest of scratching my own itch, I actually go and have these conversations because I find the topics fascinating, and this week is no different. I speak to Wynn Charles. She's the host of the Ask Wynn podcast. But in case you missed last week, it was a really great conversation with Jules Hannaford. She's the host of Hong Kong Confidential. And we connected at Podcast Movement and very quickly hit it off and realized it was going to be a fun time. And that's why I wanted to make sure I got her on the podcast. And that was great. She just tweeted out, hey, this is what it looks like in Hong Kong. And it was about the typhoon that had been rolling through. I don't know at what level it was, but it was like flooding and wind. It was kind of crazy. So if you saw that tweet, it's Jules Hannaford's tweet, and she tagged Podcast Junkies, I believe, as well. So that was fun. Check that out, episode 178. And like I said, this week, Wynn Charles. She's the host of a podcast that she's been doing for several years now. And what we talk about is what inspired Wynn to start her podcast, which is a common question that I have. But we also understand how cerebral palsy affected her ability to get the podcast out and how she's dealt with that over the course of many years and how she's overcome it. And in fact, what she's done with her podcast and starting to build her brand is really amazing because she's well known in the podcast world. We talk about her fascination with technology and what led Wynn to decide on an interview format. We talk about what inspired her to get an education degree and her rock climbing adventure, which I thought was fun. So full show notes available at podcastjunkies.com/179. Just a quick recap of the week. It was interesting because I was at the Thrive conference and I was here with some folks that the listeners might know, John Dennis and Chris Kermitzotes. They're the creators of the PodFest Media Expo conference, which is coming up in March in Orlando, and I'll be speaking at that as well. But we ended up here at Thrive in Vegas. It's a conference put on by Cole Hatter, and John helps Cole with the marketing. And so it was interesting. There's a lot of inspiring speakers. I tweeted out about a couple of them. And as is the case with all of these conferences, sometimes there's good ones and sometimes there's bad ones, but then occasionally there's great ones. I'm gathering my notes, and I think I'll put it in the form of a blog post so I don't make this go on too long, but I just wanted to give you an update. I really had a good time. It's always fun when I come to Vegas and connect with folks. Shout out to Ellery Wells. I ran into him as well. He's been here for all of them, so I think he's been attending all four. So I'm trying to think if there are any other podcasters specifically. James Van Proyen was here helping with the PodFest booth. So that was cool to see him as well. But introducing people to the world of podcasting is always fun. So stay tuned to the end of the show where I reveal this week's retention hashtag. And just a reminder, if you are needing help with your podcast, whether it's launch or you have an existing show and you want an audit of it, or you would like some coaching to have everything done for you, that's a lot of the services that we provide through Fullcast. It's fullcast.co. If you have any questions about help with your show or launching a show, then don't forget to reach out. Send an email to harry@fullcast.co, and we'll jump on a call and see what makes sense for you. Don't forget to listen to the end of the episode where we reveal this week's retention hashtag. But for now, enjoy my conversation with Wynn. So Wynn Charles, host of the Ask Wynn podcast, thank you so much for joining us on Podcast Junkies.
You make me sound so professional, Harry Durant, and you're welcome. And before we get this interview started, I got a text with your name in it after our episode aired together on my podcast, which you guys should probably go back and listen to so you get the gist of my podcast. And basically, the text said, "Thank you for bringing Harry Durant on to your podcast. I'm trying to start a podcast. And this was from one of my fans that I didn't even know listened to the podcast. So you're making a huge impact on my fan base as well as your own fan base there.
Well, that's really nice to hear and really inspiring, Win. So thank you for sharing that. I'm wondering if we could just start. There's so many questions in terms of like why you've been so consistent with your show, but can you think back to when it was or what it was that inspired you to start your own show?
Well, as I said to you when we were doing our interview, I have Apple toys, the iPhone, the iPad, and I had a Mac at one point. And so I was in iTunes all the time. I'm on my phone all the time. And I think quickly discovered in iOS 8 at the time, my God, now we're up to iOS 12 and they still have it. I quickly discovered the big purple button. And me being a curious cat that I am, goes, what's this button? And so I open it up. Of course, there's nothing there. But then I see the words RSS feed. And I'm like, well, let's just type something in. I think I typed writing. It certainly wasn't podcasting. And so then I got a whole new world opened up to me. Thank you, Apple Podcast, aka iTunes, aka I don't know what to call it anymore. I think we're branding it as Apple Podcast all across the board. So no more iTunes, and except on desktop version. And so then I looked and looked and looked and looked and looked for something about disabilities. And I could not find one. I'm like, what the heck is going on here? Why isn't there's a woman's voice on disabilities? And then I thought, okay, I'm going to start a podcast. Of course, I tried every single podcast service known to man until I got so sick of it that I started literally weeping on Blog Talk Radio. I remember the day. The guest that I was trying to interview could get in to Blog Talk Radio. And I remember the day. And I said to my fan base, weeping me, I said to my fan base, this is it. I'm not giving up on this podcast journey. And I am going to give you guys a podcast, come heck or high water, and I will figure out how. So then I went to a podcasting group on Facebook and said, how do I do this? I had no clue whatsoever. And they go, listen. And about 10 people said to me, Lipson, 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 Lipson. And I'm like, okay, I finally bit the bullet and took the plunge into the fabulous Lipson service, and they have never let me down since.
So if you could also, what I think would be helpful for the listeners is to sort of talk about your mindset, because you have cerebral palsy, and it's something that's been something that you've had to live with for your entire life. And I'm wondering if there was anyone. You said you didn't see a lot of disability podcasts, but I'm wondering, was there someone in, maybe not even in the podcasting space, have you seen, obviously you've got people that you look up to, maybe that have cerebral palsy that have done magnificent things. And I'm wondering if any of those come to mind.
I'm going to answer this question to the best of my abilities. And I follow so many different people with disabilities, not cerebral palsy per se, because cerebral palsy is so different. In a nutshell of CP, you can have people that are non-verbal. You can have people that use communication devices. You can have people that are non-walking. You can have people that can't do anything for themselves. Yet I have moderate cerebral palsy. I can walk, I can talk, but yet I need full assistance. in dressing. I can do the podcast independently, of course. So I don't really follow anyone with cerebral palsy. So I am on the cutting edge because I live with it, and people seem to like that story. And so I didn't start the podcast because I followed someone with cerebral palsy. I started the podcast on my own. I mean, men are doing podcasts more than women as we sit here today recording this interview. But I don't think I followed anyone. I just said the heck with it. I'm going to put my voice into this podcasting space.
I mean, obviously, it seems like because you were indicating that you were very familiar with the different iTunes versions, I get the feeling that you've been attracted to technology itself. Maybe, obviously, maybe not podcast specifically, but do you remember like your earliest connection with technology?
My earliest connection was the Apple QE2, and for those of you that grew up in the 90s, before AOL, before you got mail, and before we had iPads and cell phones, I remember the Apple QE2 sitting in the middle of my classroom to be used only by me and my aide as a assistive device for me.
And what was that device?
A huge Apple desktop computer that took up the size of the room.
Did you have other folks that were like, is there a community when it comes to, the people who are, I guess, category of people who are producers with disabilities? You've probably been at the forefront and a pioneer in this space, but have you since discovered a community of folks who like to use technology to get the word out?
Not really, and you would be surprised by that. I know there is one podcast by Jacob Holt, the Ability Podcast, which I've been on. Thank you very much. Jacob Holt's kind of calling me and said, "Do you want to come on my podcast?" Because I knew what I was doing, but not very many women with disabilities are doing podcasting.
And so it's hard sometimes when there's no one there to pave the way for you, because there's no one you can look to for inspiration.
It definitely is. And what I'm trying to do is now give it back to the podcasting community and give back to the disabled community as well to get their voices out there as well.
Because now that you've taken such an early step with the show, and it looks like you've been doing it since 2017. Is that about right?
Yeah, 2017. I was a late adopter to this podcasting realm.
Well, it's okay because there's always new people coming in, and they always say the best time to start a podcast is yesterday, and then the second best time is today. And I think you did the hardest part, especially with the challenges you may have had in the beginning, to kind of put your foot out there and put your mark out there. And I'm sure there was a lot you probably would have done differently in the past. And every podcaster knows that their 10th is going to sound better than their first, and their 50th is going to sound better than their 10th. So I'm wondering if you initially landed on the interview format as something that would be the ideal one for you.
I tried to do a solo show, and I tried to do a solo show on Spreaker and again on Anchor, which Anchor is gone in a hot water right now. If you guys know anything about Anchor, they're in hot water because they take all the content. And so I gave up the solo show. I stuck with the formatted show because if I'm going to do this and put all my time and money and energy and more time into this, I am going to at least have a buddy to talk to on the other end.
How often do you try to stay in terms of the frequency of the shows? Like how many do you want to get done?
Well, as we're recording this, I did 2 yesterday and 1 today, and then I did you, but you didn't count. So you's only for me. So I do about a solid, I would say, 5 a week. I tried to do it Mondays to Friday, And on the occasional Saturday and Sunday, I do it only on the occasion. And so I try to keep it consistent. And one of the tips I want to give newbie podcasters is consistency. If you're going, my podcast comes out like a dot. It comes to podcast players on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Friday mornings, and it comes to everyone's podcast player, including Spotify. So that being said, if you say I'm going to do a podcast every single Tuesday, you have to do it every single Tuesday. Or if you're going to say I'm going to do a podcast every single Monday and have it out, you have to do it. I don't care what you say because the podcasters rely on their favorite podcast coming out. Like I rely on the podcast Junkies coming out on a weekly basis or monthly basis. I don't know how you do it. When I see podcast Junkies, I normally click on it when it's out.
So I appreciate that. And I appreciate the shout out for Podcast Junkies. But who else is inspiring you from people that are in the podcasting space that have been doing it for a while?
I would say the team over at Lipson does a fabulous job. They actually have the podcast called The Feed, FEED, and not as in cooking feed. Although there's a podcast called The Feed all about cooking too, which I've subscribed to. So it's a great show. Also, the new media show hosted on Blueberry by Todd Cochran and Bob from Spreaker. They do an hour show, and it's a fantastic show. And so I am a podcast. And of course, let's not forget that the Orange Podcast, Junkies, is one of my favorites because you seem to do a fantastic job with the retention hashtag. I get a lot of inspiration from podcasts. I mean, I have my headphone in my ears practically when I wake up in the morning, and I find new podcasts every single day.
How have you grown with all these interviews that you've done? How have you grown yourself as a podcast host?
Right now, as we speak, I'm actually finishing up a summer school class about writing and recording for new media. That class has taught me a lot. That class hasn't killed me yet, but I feel like since taking that class, I also took a class strictly on podcasting and got college credit for it. It's the first podcast class in the nation that my instructor developed, and he was in the radio scene, also in the podcasting scene. So he approached my college and said, "Do you want to do this?" And they said yes. So I was lucky enough to be one of the ones doing a podcasting class and actually getting college credit for it. So you have to look on the rocks to find your little inspirations and little doses of gold here. Although I still don't like Adobe Audition. That's why I hire a podcast editor of Emily Pope Cop of The Story Behind, and she now runs ePodcast Productions. So that's my podcast editor. And starting in September, I'm going back to her and say, "Here, edit. You know better than I do what to take out to make me sound better." And I know in emergency cases how to get around Adobe Audition. But do I like to use it? No. But do I like to record podcasts? Yes. Do I have the fancy podcast mic? Yes. But right now, I don't have a computer that's strong enough to handle my podcast. But that's going to change in the next months. But also, I hope. But I want to be in this industry as long as I can.
Do you notice that you have a different style when you first started interviewing than you do now?
Yeah, I, like everyone else, was nervous as no tomorrow because I came from the writing industry. I didn't come, and I actually came from the teaching field, believe it or not. And I didn't come from the radio background. So what I um, decided to do is kick a, kick my podcast off with someone really well known in the self publishing industry for books, and you can actually hear my voice being shaky and ugh, and sound awful. She's the one that actually calmed me down because she started before I did on Amazon new Amazon podcasting services, and still to this day she uses Amazon podcasting services. I mean, when she started back in 2000. I'm about to say 2009, and this is Joanna Penn of the Creative Pen. And there was no Lipson, there was no Blueberry, there was no anything.
Yeah, it's interesting because those early days, those people are really pioneers because they broke a lot of new ground for podcasters like ourselves.
Yeah, and I applaud her for getting on the mic and doing what she did. And I still applaud her for making it not only in the podcasting space, but making it in the writing space as well. And she's one of my she heels slash my mentors, not only for the writing space, but for the podcasting space.
So you mentioned you started off teaching and writing. So is that what when you first went to school, that's what you majored in?
I majored in early childhood education. The journalism degree is my second degree.
And was there what were you thinking like when you had that as your major? Was there something that someone was inspiring you at that time?
My mother, and God knows I love her, but she forced me to she forced me to go into education. God knows I love my mom, and I sadly lost her to meningitis slash brain aneurysm. They called it the brain aneurysm, but medical malpractice. Meningitis took it down. So I'm a huge advocate for viral meningitis now, even though I don't seem to like it. And I'm a huge advocate for brain aneurysm, even though I don't seem to like it because that one hit me personally. And she was my aide until the day she died. And then I've gotten help from aides throughout these 7 years, and it will be 7 years on Sunday that she passed away. And so my mother forced me to go into education. She had her blinders on. She forced me to get, she didn't force me, but my boss emotionally abused me. And my dad, God bless him, he pulled me out of that situation. She wanted nothing. She saw what was going on. She wanted nothing to do with it.
The good news is that you were able to turn that situation around and move into a career that seems like it suits you more for your personality.
Yes, exactly. And I'm still in the education field. I this will be starting in September. This will be my 13th year in education. This year, I'm actually transferring over to the admin side of education. So less kid work, more admin work, and I'm happy about that. But I'm very lucky. I'm in a position that my work supports my podcast. I've had my boss on my podcast. I've had, and they want to, one of the projects they want me to do is interview one of the teachers who I work with on my podcast. They said, let's bring the podcast into this and let's have you use your podcast as a creative outlet slash work. And so I'm in the lucky position where my work supports my podcast literally two ways. It supports my podcast hosting fee, and then it also supports my podcast creatively because one of our core philosophies at Country Day, Aspen Country Day, where I work, is the arts, whether it be drama, creative writing, podcasting, and my colleagues actually listen to my podcast.
This is like something I think about as you say that. You can't help but inspire, not only people who with disabilities, but just people in general when they hear your story, because it just, for all those people who don't have a disability and haven't started their podcast, I mean, what more of a fire needs to be lit under them than to just to hear your story? Because in terms of people who had roadblocks placed in front of them, I would say you've definitely had your share placed in front of you, and it doesn't seem to have stopped you.
No, it doesn't stop me. And I was scaling up rocks yesterday. I live in Aspen, Colorado, as you guys know, and I got to go out in Mother Nature and go rock climbing yesterday. I started, this is a new little adventure I've started. I actually rock climbed when I was 10 at a camp for people with disabilities. Fell in love with it. It got put to the wayside. I don't know why. And then my dad goes, "Do you want to go rock climbing?" And I'm like, "Sure." I did it once when I was 10, but I'll try it again. I fell in love with it again. So that's an interesting fact. I had a hidden passion since I was 10. I just didn't know how to get it out of me again. But yesterday I got to the point where I got to go outside and see what Mother Nature had to give me. And Mother Nature was nice to me. And yeah, so that's one of my passions.
It's really nice to hear because, sometimes we get stuck so long behind a computer and we get so locked in because, there's so many things we want to do and there's never a shortage of distractions there. So I'm glad to hear that you have the ability to reconnect with nature, which is really important because I think sometimes even just, for us, just like we'll walk around the block or just some time spent staring at some trees or a mountain. And Aspen, Colorado must be absolutely gorgeous.
It was. And where I got taken yesterday, there was no noise. The occasional car would drive by, but I mean, you could hear a pin drop. You could hear a pin drop as I was doing this. And I'm like, well, I can see why people love it because, and yes, there will be a podcast episode about me going rock climbing. Yeah, yes. So I can inspire people just a little bit more to go out in Mother Nature without their headphones. And I almost recorded something on my phone for you guys, but my phone wasn't capable hands, and I wasn't capable hands. I just had to listen to instructions yesterday. So I thought the podcast will be going out to the door when I'm out here. And it was planned, of course. People knew I was going off the grid, so no one bothered me. And it was like no one wanted me. No one wanted to bother me till about 5 o'clock. And I'm like, you guys are the best. Also, I had an assistant on ground doing all my scheduling for the podcast. And so I'm like, well, we should do this more often. As long as you tell people that you're going off the grid into Mother Nature, they'll expect that.
Yeah, they should. I'm curious when, like, with all that you've accomplished so far and all that it seems that's on your plate right now, are there things that you still have in terms of like, I don't know if you'd call it a bucket list or just a wish list, but just kind of like bigger aspirations, maybe even somewhere you want to take the show or something else you want to do personally?
One of my bigger bucket list things is to go hug everyone in the podcasting space at Podcast Movement. I'm trying so hard to get out get to podcast movement, it's not even funny because the last conference I went to was in the education space. I'm like, I need to go to one now in the journalism space because I need to get hugs from Emily, from you, from everyone else who we all know by voice. We don't know these people. We know voices,
Yeah.
but we don't get to hang out. And what I've heard from podcast movement is this last time was the best one yet.
Yeah, the one in Philadelphia was really nice. It's just become almost like a family reunion, and I've been to five straight. So every year you keep seeing your friends, and yeah, definitely the next one's going to be in Orlando in August. So you should start making the plans to be there.
Try. I'm trying, Haley. I'm so trying. No, that's what the benefits of teaching. I get the best of both worlds. I get to do journalistic work and play teacher on the side and get summers off. So that makes for a happy podcast movement when you don't have to take vacation time off.
Yeah. I'm wondering when, now that you've been doing the show for a couple of years, and are you getting more opportunities to speak in different audiences, or are people finding you and inspiring you? Are you inspiring them to maybe start their own show?
People are finding me. It's so funny you mention that because yesterday I was talking to a woman who's a friend of mine in the disabled advocacy space, and she goes, "When I want to start a podcast on my website," and she goes, "Maybe you can help me." And I said, "I would be honored." So we're meeting next week, so I could help her and her daughter share their story on a podcast. So, and I've also hired a publicist to help me out, but and she as an extra benefit to me, she's booking her clients on my podcast. I didn't even ask for that. I asked for me, but I didn't even ask for the extra benefit of podcasting. So if you guys can afford anything, I would say forget the. I know podcasters say the podcasting mic and the podcasting equipment, but I would say invest in a publicist or invest in someone that could help you schedule the podcast on or even better in an on-demand calendar system like Haley and I use Calendly because when you're trying to do an interview show like we do, it's nuts. It's nuts. So if you hand the people the Calendly link and just say, "Here, pick a time," and then that makes it happen. And I hired my best friend who also has CP, and she knows now how to upload the podcast. I first gave her scheduling, and then I was uploading the podcast. Second, I gave her once she got mastered at scheduling. I gave her another job. I said, "Here, upload the podcast," and I taught her how to do it. And that's how my podcast magically appears. She uploads it. I don't even touch anything anymore.
Well, I think you're taking advantage of focusing, like they say, like my business coach says, it's important that we focus on our genius. And I think your genius is in making the connection with your guests and having those interviews. And thankfully, you've been able to get some help to do some of the stuff that's maybe someone else's genius. And so they can focus on that. And I think that's the way that you're going to grow the show.
That's the way that I'm going to grow the show. I gave my scheduling to organized person, and I gave the podcasting upload duties to a young millennial who's better at technology than I am. I swear, she's better at technology than I am.
They always are.
And because I'm on the other side of millennial, I'm like, here, I don't want to deal with Lipson. You log into my account, you deal with it, and I will just pay the hosting fee. And So that's what I do. And of course, Lipson is great. I can't speak any more highly of them than I do because they are great. They respond on Twitter. And of course, today they have Promote the Child of Yourself Friday. So I tossed a podcast episode at them and they retweeted it. And so Lipson is one of the best podcasting hosts out there. Lipson is not paying me to say that, by the way. But I think Blueberry is good too. And I'm slowly but surely bugging Lipson. I won't say bugging, but I will say bugging. Bugging Lipson to put Ask When on the Alexa skill because I think the smart home speaker is the next best thing. I mean, it's podcast Junkies is already on the Alexa, and I'm on the list. It's slowly but surely coming to Ask When, where Ask When will be part of your morning briefing on the Alexa. And so I think that will go to show us, well, use the methods that you already have. Use the destinations to promote it on Twitter. Use the destinations, even though Facebook got wonky on Lipson, still try and use it, but use the destinations of Spotify. I mean, they say that Spotify is coming up and popularity for podcasting. That's what the feed keeps telling me. And I believe it because all these millennials know about Spotify. I mean, my stepsister, who's a millennial, she goes, I open up my Spotify app, I find the music list I like. I want to say I open up my Spotify app and find a podcast I like, but she's into music. But I think it's the next generation. So when I got Ask When into Spotify, I was the happiest camper on the planet because everyone had Spotify on their phones.
Yeah, it's definitely becoming the number 2 destination, and I had the same experience because I found out my father was listening to podcasts. He's 74 years old, and my first question is like, "Where did you hear them?" And he said, "Oh, Spotify," because he was already listening to music there.
Yeah, exactly. No, and these millennials are using things that they know and how to get around in. So I think the podcasting is here to stay, and I hope to be one of those legacies in the podcasting field that keeps promoting these stories and keeps the disabled advocacy up.
Well, you definitely are, Win, because I mean, you're what you're doing is inspiring a lot of folks, not even folks with disabilities, but folks who can't find an excuse now that they've seen what you've had to overcome to get your show and to continue to produce your show on a regular basis. So I definitely applaud you for that, and I applaud you for your consistency, which is something that not a lot of podcasters do as well. So I think you have this natural curiosity for wanting to speak to people and get good stories out of them. So I really applaud you for continuing to do that. And I'm just curious what you see in the future, what excites you about podcasting as you look forward to the next couple of years.
I see in the future that I will get my podcasting equipment back up and running, and I will get a stable computer where I can use this equipment to make me sound as good as I can. And I see in the future that millennials are going to be saving the podcasting industry because of Spotify and because of Google Home and because of, which by the way, you can find Ask When in Google. I didn't do anything magical. Google just put it in there for me. And so because of Google Home and because of Alexa, I think these podcasts are here to stay. I don't think blogging is dying by any means, but it's so funny because my college actually pulled me out of a blog content class. They said, well, number one, it's meant for incoming freshmen, and you're not an incoming freshman anymore. You're a sophomore. And one, we don't want you to get bored. And so I'm like, well, thank you, because I don't think people have time to read blogs. They have time to listen to Ask Win and podcast junkies in the feed while they're walking the dog. I mean, who has time to read RSS feed anymore? I don't.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're definitely got your finger on the pulse because, like you said, with Alexa, the future is going to be voice. I mean, with all these Google Homes and Alexas showing up in homes and cars, I mean, we're moving into really like a voice activated environment in a lot of the spaces where we normally would try to operate things by, but what happened with when the iPhone came out is everything became apps and people using everything on their phone. I think that the next app or the next killer app is actually going to be voice, and Gary Vaynerchuk talks about it a lot. So I think you're definitely smart to be thinking about that as the future.
Yes, and considering I come from the AOL, you got mail generation. Although I'm on the other side of millennial, I love Siri. I love podcasting, as I said. That's why we're here today doing this interview. The next generation of podcasters are going to be more into the Alexa skills and more into the Google Home skills than even you and I were. I mean, I think a voice. I know voice is here to stay, and radio is having a hard time. I mean, speaking of the new media show, when they did the breakdown of podcast movement, they said we're going to bring a radio expert on, and he said something to the effect of millennials are not smart enough to work a podcast. I screamed at my phone when he said that. I'm like, and you should go put that one in the show notes. I think it's called, I'll send it to you so people can hear it people can hear the new media show what this radio guy actually said. I screamed at my phone. I'm like, you have got to be kidding me. There's no radio station on Alexa. There's no radio station on Alexa. I can barely find my own radio station, and I know where it is physically. I can barely find it on the interview. And of course, what? They don't have a podcast. Of course, NPR has a podcast of first, but they're national. So these local radio stations haven't figured out how to syndicate. And I feel like walking into my local radio station next week because they're right across from they're right next door to where I rock climb. And I feel like saying to them, you guys need to make a podcast and I will help you do it, because you can't find a local radio station in LA on Alexa. You can't find a local small town radio station on Alexa. So if the radio industry wants to die, that's fine. But we're all in this digital world. I mean, newspaper journalism is dying. People ask me all the time. They say, why don't you write a fashion column for a newspaper? And I'm like, you have got to be kidding me again. I mean, I would rather do a podcast on fashion than write for a newspaper. Jeez.
Yeah, so you definitely have your finger on the pulse. Just a couple of questions as we wrap up that you may have already heard before, if you're a fan of the show. But what's one thing you've changed your mind about recently?
And I knew you were going to ask me this question. I should be more open to going out in Mother Nature and disconnecting, and that's what I figured out yesterday, that I love it. And I should be more open to the new space of podcasting. And I had that reflection as I scrambled up a rock yesterday, because I'm like, people could hear a pin drop. And so if people don't get on the pulse of podcasting, they're not going to be turned back. I mean, in the next lifetime, I think we're all going to be turning around and going to these radio stations, and they're all going to be turning into iTunes podcast, I hope.
Yeah, probably. What's the one most misunderstood thing about you?
A lot of people think that I can't do what I set my mind to, and they now I'm in the rock climbing community, which there's a huge stigma behind the rock climbing community, because even though we love YouTube, people tend to Google how to rock climb, and then they go to these certified instructors and give them a mouthful, because they say, I want to do it myself. And these certified instructors, by the way, I went with one yesterday who knows me really, really well. And we went, we started on a rock climbing the wall in March, and then progressed to climbing up rocks outside. And so, what I need people to know is that even though I have a disability, I could set my mind to it, and I'll ask for help. The smallest thing is I'll ask for help. I'll figure out a way to do it.
Well, it's definitely inspiring, Win, and I love the fact that you were persistent in reaching out to me to be on your show, and we finally made that happen. And then we had a couple of scheduling challenges, and we were able to make this happen. So I think it's just
because of podcast movement.
Yeah.
Because of podcast movement. That's why I scheduled the next thing. You emailed me, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna let this podcast will happen in good time.
Yeah.
Because I know he's going to podcast movement.
Yeah.
You made him public on the show, and if you guys want to go listen to another fabulous podcast, which you have had this person on your podcast, go listen to Inspired Money. I'll be on Inspired Money myself, hosted by Andy Wong,
Yep.
who runs Money Mean Capital, and he talks about money, and he is a wonderful podcaster.
Yeah.
So if you want to know a little bit more about finance, but not in the financial way, you need to go listen to Inspired Money. And the reason why I say that on a podcasting show is not only does it take a little bit of investment of money to start a podcast, it takes more of investment of time to start a podcast. I mean, you can't say I will start a podcast and ignore your family. I mean, I put this podcast interview on my schedule. Everyone knows that I'm doing it. And so that's what I would say about that.
You're truly an inspiration to not only podcasters, but anyone who's looking to, get started and follow something that is their passion and their dream. So I'm glad we were able to make this time, and I'm glad you were able to share your story with my audience. What's the best place for folks to track you down online?
People can track me down online via Twitter, Win, W-I-N, Kelly, K-E-L-L-Y, Charles, C-H-A-L-S. And if you don't mind, because I like to do this, people can also send me text messages to 970-618-8840 if they really need to get a hold of me and really want to talk and don't want to talk about it publicly, because sometimes Twitter can get a little tricky and DMs always don't work. So people can follow me on Twitter. They can simply text me and I'll get back to them.
Well, that's really bold of you to share your phone number publicly, but I think you know the reason why you do it.
And no, I'm happy. I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to do it because there are so many people out there that aren't as lucky as I am, and I just want to give it back to this community now, because when I was struggling with my podcast on Blog Talk Radio, which don't use Blog Talk Radio people to start your podcast. The people were kind enough to me. They didn't know my story at the time. They just gave me their advice, and their advice was a listen. And of course, I took the advice after 10 comments, but because I was afraid of the return on investment. Now, the return on investment is I get stuck in people's earballs.
Well, that's a good point. Well, I appreciate you sharing your story. I wish you the best of success with your show, and I'm sure you're doing a lot of good things in the future.
I do too, and I wish you the best of success with Podcast Junkies, and we'll make podcast movement happen. I promise you guys, you might have to see me in a wheelchair. I walk normally, but you guys may have to see me in a bright colored wheelchair at Podcast Movement, just because I can't do long distances of conference calls without my wheelchair. So when I make the leap to move out, to come out to Podcast Movement, I'll let you know the color of my wheelchair, and you guys have to give me a big hug, and have to give my support system a big hug, because without them and without aides that travel with me, and without beautiful technology, we can do what we do.
Well, yeah, you'll have a hug waiting for you at Podcast Movement, I promise.
Yep, I know. I just have to make the leap out there.
It'll happen.
And so it will happen eventually. But I appreciate you having me on. And I just want you guys to know, start that podcast and either get Harry to edit it for you. I know Harry does editing, and I know Emily does editing. So there's two good editors, and I'll help you guys. I'll teach you guys how to start podcasting, because the best time is today to start a podcast.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks so much for the time. Have a great day.
Thanks.
I really want to thank Wynn for coming on this show, and I'm just continue to be inspired by folks who others would consider having a disability, but she definitely doesn't see it that way. And she's really conscious about her efforts to connect with podcasters. And I'm really looking forward to when we do meet in person, so we can have that hug, because she's really she's got a great heart, and inspiring, other folks who may have excuses, why you aren't doing what you need to do. You hear someone like Wynn week in and week out continue to put out episodes, and it makes you think twice about stuff you might complain about. So again, podcastjunkies.com/179. Intro and outro music composed by Cedar and Soil, cedarsoil.com. Tune in next week. We've got an amazing conversation with the one and only Amy Porterfield. That was a long time in the works, and I'm excited about our conversation. She talks about some stuff that she normally doesn't talk about. So we connected at Social Media Marketing World, and we finally were able to make the dates happen. So that's going to be really, really fun. So don't miss that. That's going to be episode 180. So 20 more to 200. If you made it this far, then you're no doubt listening out for the retention hashtag. And in honor of Wynn and how she's winning, we're going to make the retention hashtag winning win. So it's WINNING win, WIN, winning win. And you can tag Wynn at Wynn Kelly Charles. So that's her Twitter handle, Wynn Kelly Charles, all one word. And myself at podcast_junkies. Thanks again for all you do to support the show. I love you guys. It's been an interesting week of reflection with the conference I was at, and I hope to talk a little bit about that, lessons learned a little bit more, or maybe put that into a blog post. But enough about me. Let me know any feedback you have on this week's show, and have a fantastic day.